Hey everyone, it's Dan and Don. Welcome back to theclinicaltrialsguru.com. It's the best place to get all your clinical trial information, and one of the things we do is we do a lot of interviews. We interview people involved in the healthcare space and the clinical trial space. Today is no exception. We have Mark Monceau. He's formerly from J&J. He was their, what were you, the director of communications? Or
I was director, corporate communications, social media.
And now he's got his own consulting company, MDM Communications. Is that correct, Mark?
That's right. Thank you.
MDM, and he's coming to us right now via Skype. Thank you very much for coming on today, Mark.
Thank you very much for having me.
And so what we're going to do, because this is a clinical trial blog, but we also cover a lot of healthcare trends, and one that's like impossible to ignore is social media. And kind of this platform shift from, TV, communications, radio, print, to everything moving online. And that entails social media as well as, other types of digital media. And Mark is an expert on this stuff. And he's going to talk to us a lot about not only how this applies to general health, healthcare in general, and what some of the issues are, but also we'll get into a little bit of the clinical trial stuff. And if you're a clinical trial company, what you can do to improve your social footprint, I guess, or digital footprint. I don't know what the buzzword is, but
I like digital footprint.
Digital footprint. Did I invent that, or is that a...
It is now.
Okay. I guess I just invented that one, man. It's pretty good.
Put that in the dictionary.
It's a phrase that people use. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Mark. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this whole space.
Sure. So I actually was a reporter for Bloomberg Business News for a number of years, working in London and then moving to the U.S., where I covered the pharmaceuticals industry, biotech, healthcare in general. Did that for a couple of years, and then joined Johnson & Johnson in their communications group, primarily for their pharmaceuticals segment. This was back in the early days of the internet, and one of my first projects was actually to put together to take on a project that someone had already started to create one of the first websites for Johnson & Johnson's farm business. Did that for a period of time and then moved on and did media relations for the corporation. So when the Wall Street Journal called, I was one of the people that would pick up the phone and answer.
Okay.
So I did that for a while, and as you can imagine, I worked there for 14 years, and as you can imagine, in 14 years, the world changed pretty significantly. What we saw about 5 or 6 years ago, we realized that the news cycle was no longer something that was dominated by 3 or 4 channels, right? So suddenly you had advents of bloggers like yourselves, people who could put positions forward and could really drive and create new news information and change the dynamics of the conversation that traditional media would be engaging in. So it dawned on us that we needed to have a presence. We needed to have some kind of face for the company in this space. And so someone had already created a history blog about Johnson & Johnson, but I realized that there was an opportunity here to create a corporate blog, a corporate presence for the company to tell its story in its own words. But more than that, more about being someplace to push out news and information, we envisioned it as being a launching pad for the company to start to develop stronger relationships and to engage with the people who were driving the news in this new environment. So it became a springboard for developing relationships with people in the healthcare blogosphere. So this would include people who are blogging about the business of healthcare, but also with, what we found quite to my amazement and surprise was that suddenly you were dealing with people who are highly influential, who are blogging about living with diabetes, or people who are blogging about different aspects of the healthcare system, physician bloggers, nursing bloggers, patient bloggers, this whole little spectrum. And I think that was a really significant discovery for us, because suddenly you realized that, from my perspective, it suddenly became this realization that organizations, companies like Johnson & Johnson, institutions like hospital chains, and governments as well, needed to move beyond just the idea of creating these vehicles to communicate with a very narrow audience. They needed to understand that this was a new way for them to engage with their customers, with the people who bought and sold or bought their products, used their products, or engaged them in different ways. From the blog, we then started to develop a Twitter feed, a Facebook presence, but also to take those learnings, those understandings of what it was like to work with those people, and start to develop ways to strengthen those relationships through meeting with them at conferences, to having informal interactions with them, both online and in person, and then looking for other ways to support them in what they were doing.
Okay,
and
now...
then, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, so since you were there kind of from the beginning of this internet shift, the shift for brands to kind of promote themselves online, so the idea for J&J was never actually to necessarily reach out and engage with patients or people using the drugs. It was mostly first to engage with the bloggers, right?
Well, J&J is a huge company. I mean, and there are over 200 different operating companies, and each of those companies work in a different way. I worked in the corporate center, the corporate headquarters.
Okay.
So my primary responsibility was to work with people on behalf of the corporation, not necessarily for the brands or the businesses. That said, when we started it, there really wasn't a lot of interaction with specific patients in the healthcare space. Certainly, as this all evolved, you saw major brands on the consumer side, like Neutrogena, like Aveeno, KY, and others, start to develop a presence, whether through Facebook, whether through creating YouTube channels or whatever it might be. Overall, and I think you must notice this as well, the presence for manufacturers of prescription products don't generally have a particularly strong presence in the social space, nor do they tend to interact particularly in a particularly aggressive way with their customers. There are notable exceptions. I just was at a meeting earlier this week where Sanofi sort of outlined some of the work that they were doing to both engage with patients and customers in the diabetes space, but also to solicit new ideas from them. To be able to develop new and better products. So they actually had engaged in a crowdsourcing exercise, which was, for the pharmaceuticals area, was actually, I think, pretty novel. But generally, there hasn't been a lot. While I was at J&J, one of the projects that did manage to build out was one where they recognized that a number of parents with children with attention deficit disorder were turning to Facebook to try to connect with other patients or other parents of patients with the disease. And they recognized there was an opportunity there for them to create I'd call it almost like a virtual coffee house, right? So they decided to use Facebook as a vehicle for them to create a place for these parents to congregate, to get information, and potentially to connect with one another, to have conversations, and to find out tips and advice to better manage their children with the disease. It's kind of a nice model. I think that's one of the things where there's a huge opportunity for manufacturers in this space to really understand that patient community, that patient need, and to be able to create services, platforms, support networks that can help facilitate that kind of interaction and that kind of engagement.
Now, Mark, does this help these type sponsors like Johnson & Johnson and Sanofi better design the protocols for their drugs? Does it help them in getting these drugs to the market better?
I think there's an opportunity there for them to do so. Certainly, you could talk to Ben Haywood and the folks at places like Patients Like Me. I think they see that crowdsourcing opportunity as a means for them to help potentially design better protocols for clinical trials. I'll be, honest with you and your audience. My experience in this area is pretty limited in terms of clinical trial design. Talking as someone who's seen this space move and evolve, I can tell you, though, I think there's an opportunity there. So it might be someplace to look.
Yeah, I'm always talking about this. Is there any particular reason, Mark, why some of these big pharmaceutical companies, it seems like when they do create content, and lately it's been videos, They seem more like commercials rather than like just someone
It's
talking to you.
amazing. It's amazing, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
you get this content, and it's it may as well be 1975 when we're all trying to
Yeah.
they're trying to encourage us to buy Coca-Cola or something, and it's shocking to me given that you have an environment where people. YouTube is a great example. I mean, here you have the second biggest search engine in the world. People are increasingly turning to YouTube for information about health. And here is an opportunity to provide education about the disease, right?
Right.
Education about a disease, education about treatment options, education about what it's like to live with that disease. It doesn't need to be crafted in such a way, that content doesn't need to be crafted in such a way where it becomes overly promotional. People aren't looking for promotional content. People are looking for content that resonates with them, that they find credible and authentic. And, now that we live in this age where the 30-second commercial is no longer what it was back in the 70s or 80s, it's surprising that you still find this constantly being made. I recently did an assessment of a number of YouTube channels that different pharma companies had made, and the content on most of it was was either highly technical or was designed in such a way that it was very patronizing.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem as a patient, and let's face it, we're all patients. We're all people who are looking for information. Generally, the content itself was not designed in such a way where it felt to me as if they were speaking to me. It felt as if they really wanted to help me. It felt more like they wanted to sell themselves or sell their company in some fashion. And accordingly, when you look at many of these channels, the number of comments, the ability, the actual number of views, the number of shares are fairly low. Right, so they build content. People don't want to share it. There are notable exceptions, and I have to give kudos to my colleague Rob Halper over at Johnson & Johnson with the YouTube channel that he created. I think at times a lot of his content can be a little more supportive or helpful. It actually, the channel itself started out with a lot of content that had been created by Dr. Nancy Snyderman, who does work on the Today Show. And her whole purpose with that content that was being created was to provide informative content to help people better understand various health conditions and hopefully, improve health outcomes with them. And so I think a lot of the subsequent content, is very similar in that vein. It tries to be, at least. So what do you guys think of it? I mean, you've seen it too, right?
Yeah, I know Don did commentary without mentioning the research clinic, your former employer, right? They did a YouTube video that you commented on, Don. What was the issue with that one?
Issue is number one is the people that they had in the video. They all seem like actors and actresses.
Yeah.
So it was very staged, and it was cold. There was no way to establish any report of what was going on there, other than this is who we are, what we do, and here's our facility. It was all staged. I think they would have been better off taking a segment of their real facility, getting a few of their employees, and just interviewing their employees and talking to their employees. And I think that would have been a lot more incredible because they can talk about their position and what they do there. And I think people are going to find a lot more connection with that than they would with somebody who's up there acting and playing the parts.
Not to be too overly critical, but I think part of the problem, at least from what I've seen with a lot of companies in the healthcare space, is that they're so used to, they really haven't evolved to a place where they kind of understand their customer. There's a big, there's an overused phrase in the pharmaceutical industry at the moment, customer at center or customer centricity.
Yeah.
Every company seems to have this new initiative around customer centricity or customer in the center of all things. It's a great idea, but the reality is that most companies don't really operate in that way.
No.
I don't think. I think the organizations still tend to be very much so this idea of, this is our message, this is how we're going to convey it to you. Take it or leave it. This is what we're trying to put forward. And I think once you start to really fully understand the needs of the customer, then it becomes easier to start to craft content that's going to resonate with them or be of importance. One of the first things I always do in terms of sort of advising different clients or working with groups is to really recommend the idea that they need to create an effective listening program, so that they understand who it is that is out there, whether it's commenting on blogs, whether it's uploading content to Facebook, or whether it's using Twitter, or whether it's using message boards. There is a lot of information that's being presented every second, every minute of every day. I saw a chart just yesterday that was saying that the number of tweets that were being put out on a daily basis, if you printed them out on a single sheet of paper, took that piece of paper and put it into book form, you would have enough books to basically reach the highest level, the highest skyscraper in the world every day. So think about that much information is being presented. Imagine the data that you can mine, that you can extract from that in terms of what people are saying, what's important to them, the kinds of words and language that they use. That all can be taken, extracted, and used to develop your messages, to develop your strategies for being able to reach them, and to really help you form your content. I think, unfortunately, we're just not at that point. And if you actually went and started to look at a lot of pharmaceutical companies, a lot of medical device companies, I would say you'll be hard pressed to find companies that are looking at the information that's being presented out there in that environment in a particularly comprehensive way through any kind of comprehensive listening program. You take that and then you move it to the consumer goods side. So, say for instance, Pepsi had a fairly sophisticated program for Gatorade, and what they did is they put together a room very much like the room that I'm sitting in here, with 5 or 6 different people whose sole purpose was to watch everything that was being said on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, whatever it might be.
Right.
Take that data, take that information, and it was fed right back into their marketing materials, fed into their communications materials, fed back into the company to help them understand what kinds of materials they needed to create, what it needed to say, how it needed to be said. But at the same time, they also would engage in real time. That's another thing that industry has a difficult time with.
Yeah.
All of that, I think, if you could take those processes, those approaches, and start to apply them to the healthcare space, I think you'll end up getting, materials that are going to be more useful to patients and to healthcare professionals. I think that you will also be in a position where you can better promote your activities there. Now, you could then take that and extrapolate it to, what you were talking about before about clinical trials. It could help you design better ways to reach those particular audiences.
Yeah, I think the problem, and we'll shift to another topic in a bit, but the problem with most, I don't want to single out pharma, but since this is a healthcare show, let's just say the problem with pharma is they think that the internet, they treat it like a platform extension of TV. Like when TV had a few channels and then cable came out, that was a platform extension. But the internet is not a platform extension of TV. This is a totally different platform, but they're treating it the same way. So they assume that if they put a commercial on YouTube, it's going to get a lot of views. And it's not, and no one's going to share it because they're going on YouTube to avoid commercials.
One of the other issues too, I had for this other company, I have a friend that works there. She's in charge of advertisement, and she had come up with the idea of also doing videos and blogs for their company on YouTube. And the reason that they did not want to do it, they were so afraid that they might say something that might get them in legal trouble later on. And I hear that so much. I've got, there was a couple other docs that I'm really good friends with that I worked with in the past that started their own research companies. The same thing, they have that fear that if I say something, I might get in trouble. And that seems to be the stigma.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, hang on a second.
Not a problem.
Sorry. Someone else has just put something through the printer. It's good that you guys are casual about this. My apologies there. But I think when we start to talk about, one of the big troubles with whether it's the pharma industry, whether it's a medical device industry, is that they're highly regulated. and the speech that they use is highly regulated. And, again, I'm sure you're both very familiar with sort of the FDA guidance around promotion for prescription medicines really limits what can be said about those products to what's in the product label. And so that becomes a very really puts a very tight control around what's being said in materials, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. In addition to that, you need to be able to provide fair balance, right? So if you mention a product and you mention a benefit, you have to provide an explanation of the risks. And the third issue for pharma and for med device companies as well is the requirement to report any adverse events that are required. So when I talk about the listening programs, one of the major barriers to doing real-time live listening and looking at what's being said in this space in a way that actually gives you the kind of data that you can use to kind of change the way you talk and present information, is going to uncover inevitably adverse events. And so there's been a lot of concern, a lot of confusion about what responsibilities the companies will have when they come across those adverse events, how they will report it, whether they would be expected to go back and say you found something on Twitter, what is the expectation? Is the company then expected to go back and reach out to the person who tweeted that and get all of the information that they need to make it a reportable event? And to date, there's no specific guidance from the US FDA around how to do that. In the meantime, that's been one of the major barriers. You add on to that, from a physician standpoint, concerns about privacy, about potential HIPAA violations. That too sort of puts a box around what can be said and how it can be said. With all that, though, I firmly believe, and certainly, at J&J they ended up doing some programs, and the Sanofi program that I just described to you, and some other companies have done other things as well. There are ways to work within that very tight framework and that very tight box. And I think part of the key of it is, quite honestly, and I think you hit on this when you keep saying the idea that a lot of what's being produced by pharmaceutical companies or healthcare companies feels like a commercial, is that when you're a consumer online looking for health information, you don't necessarily want to get into a dialogue about the drug or about the medical device. What you're really looking for is advice around the condition. What you're really looking for is insights that you can then take and either make some determinations on your own or share with your healthcare professional, and the two of you use that information in some other way. So I think that there are places for companies to operate within that very narrow framework that can be safe. The trick, though, is to provide the education, to provide the processes, to provide the perspectives that to the companies to make that happen. And I'm not going to get into too much detail on this, but another big limiting factor is that companies aren't organized to be able to support that. So what I mean by that is, we've traditionally been in this mode where you have your marketing managers who come up with your messages, you have your communications teams that come up with your messages, you'll have a medical information line and system that's there for physicians to call and ask questions, but those three groups don't necessarily interact with each other in a particularly effective way. And so they sit somewhat separately. To do this very well, you have to have connections across those different disciplines that enable you to make sure that there's sort of consistent messaging. You add on to that the fact that there's nobody, you need to dedicate resources to create that room where people listen and people respond. Those resources don't exist, so you have to take them from somewhere, or you have to build them from somewhere. So that's another major shift. And then added onto that is the idea that almost every communication that is ever made public from a pharmaceutical company or a medical device company, or for that matter for a hospital chain, is going to go through a pretty rigorous copy approval process, right? Where I used to be at Johnson & Johnson, for many of those teams in the pharmaceuticals division, there would be, to get something approved would take at least 2 weeks. That's when there would be a committee that would sit down, review the content, and that would happen every 2 weeks or so. So you had to make sure that you created everything well in advance, then it would go into committee, and then that committee would meet after 2 weeks, and then you would have that meeting, and then the information could be disseminated. And that's, fairly routine across the industry. Now, that's different than if an issue happened today and there was an announcement about a product recall or whatever. Things could move a little faster than that, but that's generally how it works. So you can imagine that doesn't quite fit the Facebook or Twitter ethos, right? So you've got to
not at all
because
come out. You got 20 minutes or 2 minutes, 20 seconds.
It's complicated for something so simple.
Yeah.
And I have a simple rule that I live by, and that's if you worry about anything litigious, don't say anything that's going to get you in trouble.
Exactly. I think that's well, it was funny when I was on the media relations side, and you were creating the messages to say in response to the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or whoever it would be. The one thing I always had running in the back of my mind is I wanted to make sure that whatever I said or whatever I did wouldn't be something I'd be embarrassed to tell my mom, right? So so to me that's kind of the level to go. So forget the litigious nonsense. To me it's even gets even more basic. I want to make sure my mom respects it, right? So
there you go.
It's a good rule. Mark, as we wrap up, because I know you got to go, and we thank you again for coming on.
Definitely, this is wonderful.
I had a question. How far are we? And, well, I guess it's two questions. And will there ever be a day when pharmaceutical brands, let's back up a little. We do this blog. We don't necessarily promote the clinical trials that we have going on at South Coast Clinical Trials, right? But we've taken ownership of this topic. And so now, by default, people understand that these guys do clinical trials. So it's like brand awareness.
Yeah.
How far are we from a drug company coming out with its own blog, but really taking it seriously and not necessarily promoting its drugs, but just promoting content around that and sort of building a trust and a brand awareness? And does it make sense for them to do that at all?
A brand awareness around the
topic, like let's say for Risperdal, right? Instead of having a blog talking about Risperdal, we have a blog talking about
schizophrenia. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's I think there are some organizations that are starting to get it. The example that I gave with ADHD, the company was less about them talking about the ADHD medicine that they sold, and in fact it wasn't branded around that at all. It was really more about providing content that could help patients with ADHD. And I think companies will get there once they really better understand the communities that they're trying to reach. Right. So it goes right back to what you were talking about before. I think that when you're talking about the kinds of content that's been created, it's this lack of full appreciation of the needs of those communities and what they're really about. But to get there, as I said, requires that structural change, requires that process change, requires the dedication of additional resources. And I think they're going to have to be one of two things, or maybe both. The first is you're going to have to see companies that get some sort of financial benefit out of doing that.
Return of investment, ROI.
Exactly. So you're going to have an organization that develops strong relationships with one particular community. Let's say it's diabetes, and by developing those strong relationships with this diabetes community, by providing them with content, information, maybe providing some kind of concierge service where they're redirecting them to information that's going to help. It's going to help them in other ways. Could be helping them to market their products. It could be that it helps them with some other initiatives, some other projects that's out there. But in some way, it helps the bottom line of the organization and gives them a real return on that investment. The other the other way that this will happen is through crisis, right? So when you look at organizations, major organizations that took on and created a better social media framework, there are a couple of really good examples of where that happened because the company screwed up or was the victim of something else, and they needed to improve their image, improve their organization through creating better social media programs. So a couple immediately spring to mind. So Dell Computer was once on the cover of Time magazine for a screw up where they pissed off a blogger who then coined the phrase Dell hell in terms of their customer service. He then started an online, this was in the very early days of blogging. He started an online initiative where people kind of voiced their annoyance with what Dell's customer service had become. And they became known as the worst in the industry for whatever that might be worth. Dell then took that, grabbed that bull by its horns, created a team within, I guess it's in Austin, where they have about 60 people now who monitor what's being said, and they respond and they provide strong customer service to online complaints and online issues. But they're also there to provide information about computing, about technology. So they've created a better ethos. Now, I currently don't have a Dell computer, so I can't speak to their customer service or whether it's any good or not, but they kind of reversed that whole trend. Another example is JetBlue. So you guys being on the West Coast, you probably haven't really flown JetBlue that often. JetBlue.
Oh yeah, Long Beach to New York all the time. I have relatives out there, and
there you go. Well, they have Wi-Fi on too, so that's
right. And the blue chips.
Yeah, and the blue chips. Well, they got into they had a huge issue. I guess it was like was it Valentine's Day? I think it was Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
There was a massive blizzard up on the East Coast, and they shut down all their flights, but they did it prematurely, and they pissed off a load of passengers, and people were having a hard time getting to their customer service line. They were going online, they couldn't get any information, they were tweeting about it, and they weren't getting any responses. And JetBlue, again, as part of their effort to kind of improve their customer service and improve their image, they created a little command center where they would tweet back to their customers. And even to this day, if you're sitting on the tarmac in Long Beach and you're pissed off, you tweet the JetBlue Twitter handle and they'll get back to you and say sorry, and we'll get it sorted out. Or if you've lost your luggage in Albuquerque, they'll tell you which person you need to go talk to on Carousel 6. So it's that kind of, it's a customer service model, but that's one of the places they needed to go. So I think if I look at the pharmaceutical industry or the healthcare industry in general, I think that there may one day be a moment where companies need to realize that these are communications tools that people use that are as valuable as the phone, and that they need to have a presence there, and they need to be able to manage it effectively, and they need to be able to communicate with those customers in a way that they expect. And that's going to, as I say, one of two ways. One is that we'll figure out a good way to provide a financial benefit, a good return on investment, and if you don't do it, you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage. And the other way is that there's going to be some massive screw up, and you're going to need to have some kind of platform in place to do that. So,
Don, any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, we could go on for a long time. I definitely want to have you back on, Mark.
Definitely would love to do that. So.
Yeah, Mark, we can end, just as I wrap up now, as far as ROI, I mean, what would be the ROI of a Viagra ad? Because technically your doctor's supposed to prescribe it, right?
Right,
so,
right.
I mean, what's the ROI there? They're wasting millions of dollars in that case.
Well, and again, you got to look at click-through rates on some of those ads too, and I think you got to question the value of a lot of those online ads about how what the true benefit is. But that's a discussion probably better served
Yeah,
days.
yeah. It's just food for thought. But I always, I always wonder when I see those drug ads on TV, and I say, well, the patients can't really prescribe themselves this. They got to still go see their doctor. So is that a waste of money? Is it not? And then I kind of relate that to blogging and social media. And, where's the trade-off? I mean, should you spend a little more money here and a little less there? And just things I think about.
And just quick in closing, I think just response to that, I think it's the way the pharmaceutical companies able now is to put the control in the patient's hands and not the doctors.
Yeah.
Before they could spend money on getting doctors to work with their product, but now they go to the patients, and these patients will now go to the doctors and say, look, I want that Viagra.
Right.
Prescribe it for me.
Right.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that. That's the huge dynamic that's changing this, and I think physicians are also struggling with that as well. Mm-hmm. They're trying to look for ways so they can better kind of interact and communicate with their patients too. But yes, I think that's part of the fact that they're just not geared for that customer service model or that support system model. And I think once they recognize that there's a benefit to it, that's going to be one of the drivers there too. So, look, I want to thank you guys very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. And if people want to follow you on Twitter, what's the Twitter handle?
It's MD as in dog, MONSEAU. So MD Monceau.
All right, and we'll put the links
good.
on there. Thank you for watching, and thank you, Mark, for coming on.
Thank you, guys.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.